When I was well again, it became clear that Siganook occupied a very special place in the household. Grandfather didn't shout at him so often and so angrily as he did at his sons, and when he wasn't there would screw up his eyes, shake his head, and say, "My Ivanka's got hands of gold. Mark my words, he's made of very fine stuff." The uncles were also very friendly and kind to Siganook, and never played jokes on him, as they did with Grigory, devising some malicious, nasty trick to play on him every evening. They used to heat the handles of his scissors, or stick a nail with the point upwards on his chair, or, taking advantage of his blindness, would give him bits of cloth all differently colored to sew up into one length, which made Grandfather swear and curse at him. Once when he was having an after-supper nap in the kitchen, on the shelf over the stove, someone dyed his face red, and for a long time he could be seen walking around, a ludicrous and terrifying figure. The lenses of his dark spectacles showed up dully against his gray beard, and his long purple nose drooped dejectedly like a tongue. The ingenuity of my uncles in thinking up fresh torments was apparently inexhaustible. But Gregory bore it all silently, and only rarely did he show signs of pain by crying out weakly. Before he touched anything made of steel, like an iron or a pair of scissors or a thimble, he would liberally smear his fingers with saliva. This became a habit with him, and even at the supper table, before taking his knife or fork, he would slobber all over his fingers, much to the amusement of the children. When his fingers got burnt, his face became a sea of ripples that flowed over his forehead and eyebrows and vanished mysteriously in his bare skull. I don't remember how Grandfather felt about the way his sons amused themselves, but Grandmother would shake her fists at them and shout, "Ought to be ashamed of yourselves, you wicked beasts." The uncles would discuss Siganook angrily behind his back, sneering at him, criticizing his work, and calling him a thief and an idler. Both of them want to have Ivan working for them when they open up their own dye works. That's why they're always pretending to find fault with him, and they make sure the other notices. They call him a bad workman, but they're lying, and it's all part of their cunning. They're afraid that they'll lose I asked Grandmother why they carried on like this, always ready and willing to make everything clear to me. She began to explain. Both of them want to have Ivan working for them when they open their own dye works. That's why they're always pretending to find fault with him, and they make sure the other notices. They call him a bad workman, but they're lying, and it's all part of their cunning. They're afraid they'll lose Ivan to your grandfather, and your grandfather's very used to having his own way. He's thinking of opening a third dyeing works with Ivanka, which wouldn't do the uncles any good, do you see? She laughed softly. They're up to their tricks all the time. Why, they'd even make a fool of God. But Grandfather can see through their cunning and teases. Yasha in front of Misha. But Grandfather can see through their cunning and teases Yasha in front of Misha on purpose. "I'm going to buy Ivan his military exemption," he says, "so he won't have to go into the army. I need him." This makes them angry, as that's the last thing they want, and they're worried about the money. It costs a fortune to buy someone out of the army. Now I was living with Grandmother again, as I did on the boat, and every night before I went to sleep she told me stories about fairies, or about her life, which was just like a fairy story. When it came to family matters, such as the sharing out of the inheritance, or Grandfather's wanting to buy a new house for himself, she spoke half mockingly, indifferently, as if she had no personal interest and were only a neighbor, and not the second in command of the family. I found out from her that Siganook was a foundling. One rainy night in early spring they found him on a bench by the front door. There he was, tucked up in an apron, Grandmother said, in a pensive, mysterious voice. He was so numb with cold he could hardly raise a whimper. Why did they leave him at the front door? His mother had no milk and couldn't feed him. She happened to know that a newly born child of mine had died recently in the neighborhood, so she left hers in its place. She stopped speaking, scratched her head, sighed at the ceiling, and went on. Poverty is worse than anything, Alexei, and a lot of what I've seen I couldn't even describe to you. It's considered shameful for an unmarried girl to have a baby. Grandfather wanted to take Ivan to the police station, but I talked him out of it. I said, let's keep him. God has sent him to replace those we lost. And I had 18. If they'd all lived, there would have been enough to fill a whole street. Imagine, 18 houses. I was married at 14 and had a baby when I was 15. But God took such a liking to my children, he kept taking them to be his angels. Oh, how happy it makes me feel, and how sad. As she sat at the edge of the bed, wearing nothing except a shift, her long black hair falling over her shoulders, she looked so huge and shaggy, she reminded me of the bear the bearded forester from Surgok had brought into the yard a few days earlier. When she crossed her snowy white breast, she laughed softly and shook all over. The good Lord took the best for himself. Ivanka brought me much joy. How I love little children. Well, we took Siganuk into the house and had him christened, and he wanted for nothing. At first I called him Beetle because he droned just like one, and crawled around the house, droning so loud we could hear him all over the house. Try and give him some love. He's a simple soul. This required no effort, and I marveled at everything he did with blind devotion. Every Saturday, when Grandfather had meted out the floggings due to all the children who had committed some offense during the previous week and had gone off to evening service, a new kind of life, entertaining beyond description, came into being in the kitchen. Siganuk would catch some cockroaches behind the stove, quickly make a harness from cotton threads, cut some sleigh runners from a piece of paper, and there, across the yellow, clean-scrubbed table, a coach and four would gallop, Ivan guiding the black steeds with a thin sliver of wood and shouting excitedly, "They're off to fetch the Archbishop!" Then he would glue a tiny scrap of paper to the back of a cockroach and send it in pursuit of the sleigh, explaining, "They've forgotten the mailbag. The monk's got it and is trying to catch up." He tied the legs of another cockroach with a thread so that it stumbled along, its head twitching, and Vanka shouted at it and clapped his hands. The deacon's just leaving the pub for evening prayers. He would show us his little mice, which he had trained to stand and walk on their hind legs, dragging their long tails behind them, and blinking their bright black beady eyes comically. He was very careful how he handled his mice, and carried them inside his coat, and fed them with sugar from his own mouth. He used to kiss them and say, persuasively, "A mouse is a very clever and affectionate animal to have around, and hobgoblins are very fond of them. It brings you good luck if you're kind to them." He could do tricks with cards and money, could shout louder than all the children, and in every way was one of us. Once, when the children were playing cards with him, he was donkey several times running. He became very depressed as a result, and sat sulking to show how offended he was, and threw his cards down. Afterwards he complained to me, his nose twitching angrily. "You don't have to tell me it was all fixed. They winked signals to each other and passed cards under the table. Do you call that a game? I couldn't cheat better if I tried." He was 19 and was bigger than all four of us put together. I particularly remember him from those festive evenings when Grandfather and Uncle Mikhail went visiting. Uncle Yakov would appear in the kitchen with a guitar, his curly hair disheveled. Grandmother would prepare some savories and bring out the vodka bottle, which was all green with red flowers cleverly worked from glass on the bottom. Dressed for the occasion, Siganuk would spin around like a top. Grigory would creep in sideways, his dark glasses flashing. In would come our nanny, Yevgenia, a pockmarked girl, red-skinned and fat as a jug, with cunning eyes and a trumpet of a voice. Sometimes the hairy deacon from the Church of the Assumption would join us, and some other mysterious people who looked slippery as eels or pikes. They all breathed heavily from excessive eating and drinking. The children were given presents, a glass each of some sweet liquid, and gradually the merrymakers became inflamed with an uninhibited but strange gaiety. Uncle Yakov would start tuning his guitar with loving care, and when this was done would always say, "Right, here goes." Tossing back his curly head, he would bend over the guitar and stretch out his neck like a goose. His tranquil face took on a sleepy look, and his lively, elusive eyes would lose their fire in an oily haze. He would gently pluck the strings and play a tune so infectious that you couldn't help standing up. His music demanded complete silence. It flowed away somewhere in the distance like a rushing torrent, seeping through the floors and the walls, stirring the heart and arousing a strange sensation of melancholy and uneasiness, which I found hard to understand. The music made you feel sorry for yourself and everyone else. Under its influence, the grown-ups became like children, and everyone sat motionless, lost in thoughtful silence. Sasha Mikhailov was a particularly attentive listener. The whole time he leaned forwards where his uncle was sitting and looked at the guitar, his mouth wide open so that saliva trickled down over his lip. Frequently he was so carried away that he slipped off his chair onto the floor, his hands thrust forward to break his fall. When this happened, he would just stay where he landed, his eyes bulging with a lifeless stare. And everyone grew stiff, as if a spell had been cast over them. Only the samovar hummed softly, but didn't interfere with the guitar's lament. The square outlines of the two windows in the room peered into the gloom of the autumn night, and now and again someone knocked softly on them. The yellow flames of the two tallow candles, sharp-pointed like spears, flickered on the table. Uncle Yakov fell deeper and deeper into a kind of stupor. With his teeth clenched, he seemed to be sound asleep. Only his hands had any life in them. The bent fingers of his right hand trembled together over the dark plectrum, like a bird fluttering and beating its wings. The fingers of his left hand tore over the fingerboard almost too fast for the eye to see. When he'd had a few drinks, he almost never failed to produce an endless song which he sang through his teeth with a nasty whistling sound. This was too much for me, and when Uncle began to sing about tramps, I burst into a wild sobbing, unable to control my feelings. Siganuk listened to the music with the same rapt attention as the others, running his fingers through his thick black hair as he looked into a corner and sniffed. Now and again he would suddenly exclaim in a plaintive voice, "Ah, if I only had a voice like that, how I should sing." Grandmother sighed and said, "You'll break your heart one of these days, Yasha. Vanya, let's have a dance." Her requests weren't always carried out, but usually the guitarist would suddenly press the palm of his hand against the strings for 1 second, then clench his fist with a wild sweep and pretend to throw something invisible and soundless onto the floor, shouting vigorously, "Away with sadness! Vanka, get up!" Siganuk would smarten himself up, straighten his shirt, and very carefully, as if he were walking over nails, take up his place in the middle of the kitchen. His tan cheeks were flushed, and he asked with an awkward smile, "A little faster, Yakov." Frenzied twangings came from the guitar. Heels thumped on the floor, the plates and dishes on the table and in the cupboard clattered. There in the middle of the kitchen was the fiery Siganuk, rushing madly like a kite, his arms swinging out as if they were wings, shifting his feet almost too fast for the eye to see. With a whoop he squatted on the floor and tossed himself like a golden bird, lighting everything around him with the glow of silk, shimmering and flowing a stream of fire. Siganuk danced tirelessly, oblivious of everything around him. If anyone had opened the front door then, I'm sure he would have danced right out into the street, through the town, anywhere. "Give me some room," shouted Uncle Yakov, stamping his feet. He gave a piercing whistle and cried in a voice that grated on the nerves, "Oh, if I weren't sorry for my shoes, I'd have left wife and children long ago." The people at the table began to fidget, and at times they too cried out, screeched, just as though they'd been burnt. The bearded Grigory slapped his bald head and mumbled something. On one occasion, he leant over to me so my shoulders were covered with his soft beard and said, right into my ear, as though he were addressing one of the grown-ups, "If your father were here now, Alexei, he would have kindled a different sort of fire. He was a kind man, and so full of life. Do you remember him?" "No."